I should have known something was wrong the moment I stepped off that transport plane. The cold hit differently in Antarctica, not just temperature, but something deeper. It crawled through my bones, settled in my chest, and whispered that I didn't belong there. But I was desperate. 3 months unemployed, relationship dead, credit cards maxed. When the Halcyon Outpost posting appeared on the contractor boards, offering triple standard wages for a year-long stint, I didn't ask many questions. The flight from Christchurch took 14 hours. I spent most of it staring out the window as green gave way to grey, then to an endless expanse of white that stretched beyond comprehension. The pilot, a weathered woman named Santos, barely spoke except to warn us about the landing conditions. "Weather window's closing fast," she muttered through the intercom. "We're going in hot. Hot. In a place where the warmest it gets is -20 Fahrenheit Halcyon." Outpost materialized from the white like a collection of metal boxes someone had scattered across the ice. Prefabricated modules connected by covered walkways, the whole structure painted safety orange that had faded to the color of old rust. Wind turbines spun frantically against the gray sky, and I could see the communication tower swaying despite its guy wires. Everything looked temporary, like it might blow away at any moment. The plane touched down on what I generously assumed was a runway, really just packed snow marked with reflective poles. As the engines wound down, the silence pressed against my eardrums. Then the wind started up, and I understood why Santos had warned us about voices. It didn't howl or whistle like wind should. It sounded like conversation in another room, muffled but insistent. Captain Harrix met me at the cargo bay. I'd expected someone younger from his personnel file, but the man who extended a gloved hand looked like he'd aged a decade for every year at the outpost. His face was leather brown from windburn, eyes pale blue and bloodshot. When he shook my hand, I felt the ridged scars through his glove, frostbite damage that had healed badly. "Eli Morgan?" His voice carried the rasp of someone who'd breathed too much dry air. "Welcome to the end of the world." He helped me gather my duffel bags while Santos and her crew unloaded supplies. The other passengers, a meteorologist and 2 technicians, huddled against the wind, faces already turning red despite their gear. Harrix moved with practiced efficiency, his movements economical and precise. "First rule of Antarctica," he said as we walked toward the main module, "everything wants to kill you. The cold, the wind, the isolation. Your own mind, eventually." He paused at the entrance. A heavy steel door painted the same faded orange as everything else. "But we've got other rules too. More specific ones." Inside, the outpost hummed with the sound of generators and ventilation systems. The main corridor was narrow, lined with pipes and cables, lit by harsh fluorescent strips that cast everything in industrial white. Here it smelled of diesel fuel, instant coffee, and something else, something organic and unpleasant that I couldn't identify. "Dining halls that way," Harrix pointed left. "Quarters are down here. Rec room's got a TV and some books, though the satellite connection's spotty." He led me past doors marked with faded nameplates. "Communications. Storage authorized personnel only. Work assignments start tomorrow. Tonight you settle in." My quarters were a metal box barely large enough for a single bed, desk and lockers. The porthole window looked out at nothing but white, sealed with an inner panel that Harrix made sure was latched tight. "Speaking of rules," he said, pulling a laminated card from his coat pocket. "Every new arrival gets one of these. Study it, memorize it. Your life depends on it." I took the card. The title read, "Protocol for Survival, Halcyon Outpost." Below were 5 numbered items. "Never look out the windows after midnight. Always answer the radio on the first call. If someone knocks at the door, check the roster before opening. Do not follow voices outside. Lights must never go out in the East Wing." I looked up, expecting to see Harrix grinning at some elaborate hazing ritual. Instead, his expression was stone serious. "You think I'm joking," he said. "These seem," I chose my words carefully, "unusual for standard safety protocol." "Nothing about this place is standard, Morgan." Harrix moved to the door, then paused. "I've been here 8 years. In that time, I've seen 17 people come through that door. 12 of them left on scheduled transports. 5 didn't." His pale eyes fixed on mine. "The 5 who didn't follow the rules." After he left, I sat on the narrow bed and studied the card again. The lamination was thick and professional, like something from a government manual. But the rules themselves sounded like folklore, Superstition. The kind of thing isolated communities develop to explain away accidents and equipment failures. I was a rational person. Engineering degree from state, 5 years in industrial automation before the layoffs. I understood systems, procedures, logical cause and effect. These rules violated everything I knew about operational safety. They were vague, unenforceable, based on fear rather than science. But as I lay in that narrow bunk listening to the wind rattle the outer walls, I found myself reading the card again and again. By the time I finally slept, I had the rules memorized despite myself. I should have taken that as a warning. My first full day at Halcyon passed in a blur of orientation briefings and system checks. The outpost operated on a skeleton crew of 8. Harrix, myself, 2 communications technicians, a medic, a cook, a meteorologist, and Dr. Ivers, who ran some kind of biological research in the lab modules. Everyone moved through their routines with the mechanical precision of people who'd done the same tasks countless times. The work itself was straightforward. I was responsible for maintaining the heating systems, generators, and water reclamation units, the basic life support that kept us from freezing to death in our sleep. The equipment was older than I'd expected, but well maintained, with detailed maintenance logs going back years. Everything functioned within normal parameters. It was the people who seemed off. They spoke in clipped, efficient phrases. No small talk, no jokes, barely any eye contact. During meals, conversation focused strictly on work schedules, weather reports, supply inventories. When I tried to ask about recreational activities or what people did during their downtime, I got blank stares and subject changes. "You'll understand soon enough," said Martinez, one of the comtechs, when I pressed him about the social atmosphere. "This place changes you. Better to keep things simple." I spent the afternoon checking the East Wing power distribution, a task that should have taken 2 hours but stretched to 4 because I kept getting lost. The outpost layout was more complex than the orientation materials suggested, with maintenance tunnels and storage areas that didn't appear on any schematic. Some passages ended in locked doors, marked with biohazard symbols. Others simply dead-ended at blank walls. The East Wing itself felt different from the rest of the facility, older somehow, though the construction looked identical. The air was colder despite the heating vents, and the fluorescent lights flickered intermittently. When I mentioned this to Harrix during dinner, he just nodded and made a note in his logbook. "Electrical systems are priority 1 in that section," he said. "Any problems, you fix them immediately, day or night." By evening I was exhausted. The dry air and altitude affected me more than I'd anticipated, leaving me with a constant headache and the feeling that I couldn't quite catch my breath. After a dinner of reconstituted beef stew and canned vegetables, I retreated to my quarters to write in the journal I'd brought for recording the experience. That's when I first noticed the movement outside. It was nearly 10 p.m., still light under the Antarctic summer sun, when I caught motion in my peripheral vision. Something dark against the snow, moving with purpose rather than blowing randomly in the wind. I set down my pen and moved closer to the porthole. The inner panel was latched, but I could see through the gap around the edges. A figure stood perhaps 50 yards from the outpost, human-shaped but indistinct in the perpetual twilight. As I watched, it raised what looked like an arm and waved. I waved back instinctively, then felt foolish. Probably another crew member checking equipment or taking readings. But something nagged at me. The figure wore no visible cold weather gear, and its movement seemed too fluid for someone bundled in layers of insulation. By the time I unlatched the inner panel for a better look, the figure was gone. Just wind-carved snow stretching to the horizon. I tried to focus on my journal, but the words wouldn't come. The silence felt oppressive, broken only by the constant hum of machinery and the irregular rattling of wind against the walls. Around 11:30 I gave up and prepared for bed. That's when I remembered the rules. Never look out the windows after midnight. I glanced at my watch, 11:47 p.m., 13 minutes. I told myself it was coincidence, but something cold settled in my stomach that had nothing to do with the Antarctic air. I latched the inner panel securely and turned away from the window. At 11:58 I heard the first scratch. It was soft, rhythmic, like fingernails drawn across metal. I froze, listening. The sound came from outside near the window. Scratch, 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 regular as a metronome. My watch read 12:01 a.m. The scratching stopped. Silence stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then, so faint I almost missed it, someone called my name, Eli. A woman's voice muffled by the wind and walls, but unmistakably familiar. My ex-girlfriend Sarah, calling my name like she used to when she came home from work. Patient but insistent, the way she'd called when I was lost in my engineering textbooks or computer simulations. Eli, come look. The rational part of my mind catalogued the impossibilities. Sarah was 3,000 miles away in Seattle. No one could survive outside unprotected in Antarctic conditions. Sound didn't carry that clearly through insulated walls, but the voice was perfect. Every inflection, every subtle accent marker that made Sarah sound like home. I found myself standing, moving toward the window. My hand reached for the inner panel latch before I caught myself. The rule echoed in my memory. Never look out the windows after midnight, Eli, please. I'm so cold. The voice was weaker now, pleading. I could picture Sarah standing in the snow, hair whipping in the wind, arms wrapped around herself for warmth. Every human instinct screamed at me to look, to help, to respond to someone in distress. Instead, I backed away from the window and sat heavily on my bunk. The voice called 3 more times over the next hour, growing fainter each time. Then silence returned, broken only by the mechanical sounds of the outpost keeping us alive. I didn't sleep until dawn. When I emerged for breakfast the next morning, Harrix was waiting with coffee and a knowing expression. "Rough night?" he asked. I nodded, not trusting my voice. "First time's always the hardest. You get used to it." He handed me a steaming mug. "You followed the rules?" "Yes." "Good." Harrix settled into his chair, cradling his own coffee like a warming device. "Some people think they know better. Those people don't last long out here." I wanted to ask what would have happened if I'd looked. What was outside my window calling my name in Sarah's voice. But something in Harrix's expression warned me that some questions were better left unasked. The rules were starting to make sense. Lucas Trent arrived on the weekly supply flight, 3 days after my first night of scratching voices. He was everything I wasn't. Confident, outgoing, the kind of person who walked into new situations expecting them to accommodate him rather than the reverse. Where I had approached Halcyon with cautious respect, Lucas treated it like a temporary inconvenience before something better came along. 12 months of this, he said, surveying the narrow corridors and utilitarian fixtures. Jesus, they better be paying combat wages for this level of isolation. Lucas was assigned to maintenance like me, which meant we shared most of our work shifts. He was competent enough with the mechanical systems, but his attitude toward the outpost protocols bordered on contemptuous. When Harrix handed him the laminated rule card, Lucas read it with obvious amusement. "Never look out the windows after midnight." He laughed, a sound that echoed strangely in the metal corridors. "What is this, summer camp for adults? Are you going to tell ghost stories around the generator too?" Harrix's expression didn't change. "Those rules have kept people alive for 15 years, Trent. I suggest you take them seriously." "Right, and I suppose the voices outside are what, polar bears with speech impediments?" Lucas tucked the card into his pocket with theatrical dismissal. "Look, Captain, I appreciate the whole mystique thing you've got going here. Really adds to the ambiance. But I'm an adult with a college education. I can handle a little cabin fever without resorting to superstition." I watched Harrix's jaw tighten, but he said nothing more. Later, after Lucas had been shown to his quarters, I found the captain in his office reviewing personnel files. "He'll learn," Harrix said without looking up. "They always do. Question is whether he'll learn fast enough." Over the next week, Lucas made his skepticism known to anyone who would listen. During meals, he regaled us with theories about mass hysteria and group psychology, explaining how isolated communities developed elaborate mythologies to cope with stress. He pointed out the logical inconsistencies in the rules, the lack of scientific basis for the restrictions. "It's textbook behavior," he told me, while we replaced water filters in the recycling plant. "Small group, extreme environment, limited outside contact. Perfect conditions for shared delusions." I bet if you trace the history of these rules, you'd find they started with one paranoid supervisor and just snowballed from there. Part of me wanted to agree with him. Lucas articulated doubts I'd been harboring since my first night, gave voice to the rational skepticism I'd been trying to suppress. But I couldn't forget the sound of Sarah's voice calling my name, or the way the scratching had stopped exactly at midnight. Maybe, I said, but what if they're not delusions? Lucas looked at me with something approaching pity. Come on, Eli, you're smarter than that. There's no bogeyman out there in the snow. No supernatural force that obeys arbitrary time limits. Just weather, isolation, and people psyching themselves out with campfire stories. He proved his point that Thursday evening. We were in the communications center, updating the weather monitoring equipment when the radio crackled to life. Standard protocol called for immediate response. Martinez usually answered within seconds, but he was in the bathroom. The radio continued its static-laden call. Halcyon Base, this is McMurdo Station. Please respond. I reached for the handset, but Lucas grabbed my wrist. Wait, he said, grinning. Let's see what happens if we break one of the sacred rules. The call came again. Halcyon Base, McMurdo Station calling. Urgent weather update. I tried to pull free, but Lucas held firm. This is ridiculous, Eli. It's just radio protocol. They're probably calling about the storm system moving in from the Ross Sea. The third call was different. The voice was the same. Professional, official, exactly what you'd expect from McMurdo operations. But something in the tone had shifted. A subtle wrongness that made my skin crawl. Halcyon Base, we know you're listening. Answer the call. Lucas released my wrist and grabbed the handset himself. McMurdo Station, this is Halcyon Base. Sorry for the delay. Go ahead with your traffic. Static filled the channel for long seconds. Then laughter began. Low, distorted, building in volume until it overwhelmed the speakers. Not human laughter. Something else. Something that found our existence amusing. Lucas went pale, but he keyed the mic again. McMurdo, please repeat your last transmission. You're coming through garbled. The laughter stopped. Silence stretched until Martinez burst into the comm center, face flushed with panic. Who answered that call? He demanded. Lucas straightened defensively. I did. Standard radio procedure. On what ring? Martinez's voice was sharp, urgent. Third. Maybe fourth. What's the big deal? Martinez and I exchanged looks. The rule was clear. Always answer the radio on the first call. We both knew it, but Lucas had let it ring deliberately. That night, Lucas disappeared. I was awakened at 3 a.m. by Harrix pounding on my door. Emergency search protocol. All hands to account for personnel. We gathered in the main corridor, 8 figures -1. Lucas's quarters were empty, his bunk unslept in. His parka hung on its hook, boots lined up neatly beside his locker. But Lucas himself was gone. Equipment check, Harrix ordered. Find out what's missing. Nothing was missing. No cold weather gear, no emergency supplies, no tools or equipment. According to every indicator, Lucas had walked out of Halcyon Base in his work clothes and cotton socks, into an environment that would kill an unprotected human in minutes. We found the footprints at dawn, bare feet in the snow, leading away from the main entrance in a straight line toward the horizon. The prints were deep and clear for the first 100 yards, then gradually became fainter, as if the person making them was growing lighter with each step. After 300 yards, they simply stopped. No body, no blood, no sign of struggle. Just empty snow stretching to the edge of sight. Harrix called off the search after 2 hours. No point, he said quietly. We won't find anything more. Later, in his office, I worked up the courage to ask what I'd been thinking since we discovered Lucas's empty bunk. The radio call, I said. What was that? Harrix was updating the personnel roster, crossing out Lucas's name with careful strokes. That wasn't McMurdo Station, he said without looking up. Then who was it? Something that wanted to come inside. He set down his pen and finally met my eyes. Something that needed an invitation. I thought about the laughter, the way it had built and distorted until it no longer sounded like any creature that belonged on Earth. And Lucas gave it one? Not the first time. Won't be the last. Harrix returned to his paperwork. This is why we have rules, Morgan. They're not suggestions. They're not guidelines. They're the difference between going home and becoming another set of footprints that lead nowhere. That evening, I found a new laminated card slipped under my door. The same 5 rules, but Lucas's fate had given them weight they'd lacked before. I read them over and over, memorizing not just the words but the implications behind them. The rules weren't about superstition or tradition. They were about survival in a place where the normal laws didn't apply, where something waited in the white silence, patient and hungry, for anyone foolish enough to break the barriers that kept it at bay. I slept with the card under my pillow that night, and every night after. Lucas's disappearance changed the atmosphere at Halcyon Base in ways both subtle and profound. Conversations became even more clipped and functional. People moved through their routines with mechanical precision, as if afraid that deviation might invite the same fate that had claimed him. Harrix updated the duty rosters to accommodate our reduced numbers, but nobody discussed the redistribution openly. Lucas simply ceased to exist in our official reality, but I couldn't stop thinking about those footprints, about the radio call that wasn't from McMurdo Station, about the rules that everyone followed without question, as if their lives depended on blind obedience to arbitrary restrictions. Maybe they did. I started spending my off hours in the storage archives, a cramped space adjacent to the communications center, where decades of paperwork molded in filing cabinets. Personnel records, maintenance logs, weather reports, incident documentation. The bureaucratic detritus of 15 years of Antarctic operations. If Halcyon Base had a history of unexplained disappearances, it would be recorded somewhere in those files. The official records painted a picture of routine scientific operations, punctuated by the expected hazards of polar research. Equipment failures, medical emergencies, weather delays. 3 personnel had died in documented accidents over the years. A generator explosion in 2019. A fall through unstable ice in 2021. Carbon monoxide poisoning from a faulty heater in 2022, all tragic but explainable within the harsh realities of Antarctic survival. It was the personal logs that told a different story. Found the first one wedged behind a filing cabinet, as if someone had tried to hide it or forgotten it existed. A water-stained notebook filled with cramped handwriting, dated 3 years earlier. The author was someone named David Chen, a meteorologist assigned to winter over during the 2020 season. Day 47, the voices are getting stronger. Morrison says it's just wind patterns, but I know what I heard. My sister's voice clear as day, calling from outside the weather station. She died in that car accident 6 months ago. How could she be here? Day 52. Found scratches on the outside of my window this morning. Looked like fingernails, but that's impossible. Nobody goes outside during blizzard conditions. Harrix says it was ice damage, but the pattern is too regular, too intentional. Day 58. Morrison broke last night. Heard his door open around 2 a.m., then footsteps in the corridor. This morning his quarters were empty, window panel unlatched. They found his tracks leading east, but only for about half a mile. After that, nothing! Like he just evaporated. The entries continued for another week, growing increasingly frantic before ending abruptly. According to the personnel files, David Chen had completed his assignment and returned to civilization on a scheduled transport. But the notebook suggested a different conclusion. I found more logs over the following days, hidden in storage boxes and tucked behind equipment manuals. Each told variations of the same story. Unexplained sounds, familiar voices calling from outside, personnel disappearing without trace. The authors wrote with the desperate clarity of people trying to document impossible experiences, to create records that might outlast their own sanity. One log belonged to Dr. Sarah Martinez, a biologist who'd worked at Halcyon in 2018. The things that call to us know our weaknesses. They learn our voices, our histories, our deepest regrets. Yesterday, I heard my daughter crying outside my lab window, my daughter who's safe in Denver, thousands of miles away. The sound was perfect, every inflection identical to her actual voice. If I hadn't memorized the rules, I would have opened that window without hesitation. I'm starting to understand what we're dealing with. Something that feeds on human connection, on our inability to ignore calls for help. The rules aren't arbitrary. They're a survival manual for psychological warfare. The most disturbing entries came from the East Wing archives, stored in a locked cabinet that I accessed using maintenance override codes. These documents went back to Halcyon's founding, written in multiple hands across 15 years of winter operations. They described an escalating pattern of encounters, each more sophisticated than the last. The earliest logs mentioned simple phenomena, unexplained sounds, equipment malfunctions, staff reporting feelings of being watched. But over time, the manifestations grew more complex and personal. The entities, for lack of a better term, learned to mimic human voices, to exploit emotional vulnerabilities, to manipulate the isolated personnel with surgical precision. One entry, dated just 2 years after Halcyon's establishment, described what happened when the East Wing lights failed during a winter storm. The darkness brought them inside. We could hear them moving through the corridors, speaking in voices we recognized. Dead relatives, old lovers, childhood friends. Morrison thought he saw his father in the hallway, beckoning him toward the emergency exit. If Harris hadn't tackled him, we would have lost Morrison that night. The lights came back on at dawn and the voices faded. But we found marks on the walls, gouges that looked like claw marks, spelling out our names in rough letters. From now on, we maintain power to the East Wing at all costs. Whatever they are, they can't manifest in direct light. The darkness is their doorway. The pattern became clear as I read deeper into the archives. The entities, whatever they were, operated within specific constraints. They couldn't cross certain barriers, couldn't manifest under certain conditions, couldn't violate certain rules of engagement. But within those limitations, they were devastatingly effective predators. The rules weren't superstition. They were a codex of survival tactics developed through years of trial and error, written in blood and disappearances. Each restriction represented a boundary that kept the predators at bay. A learned behavior that had saved lives through repetition and enforcement. I was so absorbed in the documentation that I didn't notice the changes in my own environment until it was almost too late. The temperature in the archives had dropped noticeably, my breath forming small clouds in the recycled air. The fluorescent fixtures overhead flickered intermittently, casting moving shadows that seemed to twist into recognizable shapes, and from somewhere in the ventilation system came a sound I'd learned to dread: scratching. Rhythmic and deliberate, like fingernails drawn across metal ductwork. I gathered the logs and fled back to the main corridor, heart hammering against my ribs. Behind me, the scratching grew louder, more insistent, until it sounded like dozens of hands clawing at the walls. In the safety of the communal areas, surrounded by bright lights and the comforting hum of life support systems, I tried to process what I'd learned. Halcyon Base wasn't just a research outpost, it was a fortress under siege. We weren't just following safety protocols. We were conducting psychological warfare against entities that had been studying human behavior for over a decade, and judging by the growing collection of hidden logs and crossed-out names on personnel rosters, we were losing. Dr. Ivers was the only person at Halcyon Base who'd been there longer than Harris, though you wouldn't know it from casual observation. She kept to herself, emerging from the biological research modules only for meals and mandatory briefings. When she did appear in communal spaces, she moved with the careful efficiency of someone who'd learned not to waste motion or attention on anything non-essential. I'd been meaning to introduce myself properly since arriving at the base, but opportunities were rare. Dr. Ivers ate quickly and left, attended briefings without comment, and generally avoided social interaction. It wasn't rudeness, more like someone who'd calculated the exact minimum of human contact required for survival and refused to exceed that threshold. Finding her proved more difficult than expected. The biological research section was a maze of interconnected labs and storage areas, most requiring security access I didn't have. I finally located her in Lab C, a sterile white room filled with specimen containers, microscopes, and analysis equipment that hummed quietly in the background. She looked up from her work when I knocked, eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. Dr. Ivers was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, but her face carried the weathered look of someone who'd spent years in harsh environments. Her hair was pulled back severely, and she wore the same utilitarian clothing as everyone else, but something in her posture suggested coiled tension. "Mr. Morgan," she said without preamble, "the new maintenance technician. What can I do for you? I was hoping to ask you some questions about the base, about the history here." Her expression didn't change, but I caught a subtle shift in her body language, a slight tensing of shoulders, fingers pausing over her keyboard. What kind of questions? I'd rehearsed this conversation during the walk to her lab, but now the words felt clumsy and insufficient. I've been reading through some of the archived logs, personnel records. There seem to be patterns in the documentation that aren't reflected in the official reports. Dr. Ivers saved her work, and swiveled to face me fully. "You've been in the storage archives." It wasn't a question. "Yes, some of the personal journals mention—" Stop! She held up a hand, glancing toward the door as if expecting unwanted listeners. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Not here. Too many ears." She led me through a series of connecting passages to a smaller lab filled with environmental monitoring equipment. Banks of sensors tracked temperature, humidity, atmospheric pressure, electromagnetic readings, data streams that painted real-time pictures of conditions both inside and outside Halcyon Base. Dr. Ivers activated a white noise generator before speaking. "Again, you want to know about the logs," she said quietly. "About the people who disappeared. About why we follow rules that seem to make no scientific sense." "Yes." She studied my face for a long moment, as if weighing some internal calculation. "How much did you read?" "Enough to know that the official reports don't tell the whole story. Enough to understand that Lucas didn't just wander off into the snow. Lucas," she spoke the name with something approaching regret, "cocky. Thought he knew better than people who'd survived here for years. Same story every time. Someone decides the rules are superstition, tests them, disappears. We update the rosters and pretend it never happened. But what are they?" I asked. "The things outside. The voices, the scratching, the footprints that lead nowhere." Dr. Ivers moved to one of her monitoring stations and pulled up a series of graphs showing electromagnetic readings over the past month. The data showed regular patterns punctuated by sharp spikes that corresponded to specific times and dates. "I've been studying them for 11 years, she said, pointing to the anomalous readings. "Ever since my first winter here, when I lost my research partner to what the official report called exposure and disorientation. But I know what really happened. I watched it happen." She manipulated the display, overlaying the electromagnetic data with personnel logs and incident reports. The correlation was undeniable. Every disappearance, every unexplained event, corresponded to spikes in the readings. "They're not ghosts or demons or whatever folklore you might imagine," Dr. Ivers continued. "They're something else. Something that exists in the spaces between what we understand about reality. They feed on human psychology, on our emotional connections and survival instincts." "Feed how?" "Literally. They consume some essential component of consciousness, leaving behind empty shells that can't survive in this environment. The footprints that fade to nothing? Those are people being drained of whatever makes them human, becoming lighter and less substantial until there's nothing left but a pattern in the snow." The white noise generator hummed in the background, masking our conversation from any potential listeners. I thought about the laughter on the radio, the perfect mimicry of Sarah's voice outside my window. "But the rules work," I said. "They keep us safe." "The rules create barriers," Dr. Ivers corrected. "Psychological and behavioral boundaries that limit their ability to interact with us. They can't cross certain thresholds, can't manifest under specific conditions, can't influence us if we maintain proper protocols." "Why? What makes the rules effective?" She shook her head. "I don't know. Maybe it's about attention and invitation. They need us to engage with them, to acknowledge their presence or respond to their calls. Maybe it's something more fundamental, about the nature of reality in this place. Antarctica is different, Mr. Morgan. The isolation, the extremes, the way normal rules of physics seem to bend under the stress of constant survival." Dr. Ivers pulled up another data set, this one showing infrared readings from external sensors. The images revealed heat signatures moving across the ice, human-shaped figures that appeared and vanished without explanation, leaving no physical traces. "They've been here longer than we have," she said. "Probably longer than humans have existed. We're the invaders in their territory, and they've learned to hunt us with patience and precision. The rules aren't protection, they're a peace treaty. We limit our behavior to patterns they can't exploit, and they allow us to maintain this precarious foothold in their domain. Then why stay? Why not evacuate the base? Because they're learning." Her voice carried a weight of exhaustion that spoke of years spent fighting an unwinnable war. "Every encounter teaches them something new about human behavior. Every person who breaks the rules and disappears gives them data about our psychology, our weaknesses, our survival mechanisms." She gestured toward the monitoring equipment surrounding us. "I'm trying to understand them well enough to predict their behavior, maybe develop new rules that could expand our survival parameters. But it's like trying to study predators who can read your thoughts and manipulate your perceptions. A soft alarm chimed from one of the sensor arrays. Dr. Ivers checked the readings, then quickly began shutting down the monitoring systems. "Electromagnetic spike building outside," she said tersely. "They know we're talking about them. Prolonged discussion draws their attention. What should I do? Follow the rules. All of them, all the time, without exception or interpretation. Don't try to be clever or find loopholes. They've heard every rationalization humans can devise." She handed me a notebook filled with additional observations and guidelines. "These are supplementary protocols I've developed. Memorize them, but don't discuss them with anyone else. Knowledge shared too widely becomes knowledge they can access." As I prepared to leave, Dr. Ivers caught my arm. "One more thing, Mr. Morgan. The rules protect us, but they don't make us immune. They're patient hunters, and they've learned to exploit our psychology in ways we're still discovering. Trust nothing that seems too convenient, too comforting, or too familiar, especially the familiar voices." I left her lab with more questions than answers, but also with a clearer understanding of our situation. We weren't just isolated researchers struggling with cabin fever and harsh conditions. We were prey animals in a carefully constructed trap, dependent on an arbitrary set of behavioral restrictions to stay alive. The notebook Dr. Ivers had given me contained dozens of additional observations and rules, each one representing another piece of the survival puzzle. As I read through them that night, I began to understand the true complexity of our situation. We were fighting a war of attrition against entities that had all the time in the world to study our weaknesses, and we were losing, one broken rule at a time. The storm arrived on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after Lucas disappeared. Antarctic weather moves with deceptive speed. Clear skies can become whiteout conditions in minutes, transforming the landscape into an alien hellscape of wind and ice. This one built slowly over 2 days, a massive system that satellite imagery showed stretching across half the continent. By Tuesday evening, we were locked down tight. Wind speeds exceeded safe operational limits, visibility dropped to 0, and the temperature plummeted to levels that would kill exposed skin in seconds. Standard protocol called for minimal movement between modules, emergency communications only, and strict adherence to all safety procedures, including the rules. I was in my quarters, updating maintenance logs by lamplight to conserve generator power, when the knocking started. 3 sharp raps against the main entrance, barely audible over the howling wind. Then silence. Then 3 more raps, more insistent this time. The sound carried through the metal corridors with acoustic clarity that shouldn't have been possible given the storm conditions outside. I set down my pen and listened, hoping someone else would respond to whatever unfortunate soul had been caught outside in the blizzard. But I knew the protocol. Rule 3. If someone knocks at the door, check the roster before opening. The knocking came again, accompanied by a muffled voice shouting through the wind, "Help me! Please, someone help me." The voice was male, desperate, with an accent I couldn't place. Not one of our crew. I'd learned everyone's vocal patterns during my weeks at Halcyon. This was someone else, someone who shouldn't have been within 100 miles of our isolated outpost. I grabbed my jacket and emergency flashlight, making my way through the darkened corridors toward the main entrance. The knocking continued at irregular intervals, sometimes frantic, sometimes weak, as if the person outside was losing strength. "Please, I know someone's in there. My radio's dead, my GPS is fried. I just need shelter until the storm passes." Harrix emerged from his quarters as I reached the main corridor, his face grim in the emergency lighting. Martinez appeared from the communications center, followed by Dr. Ivers and the rest of the skeleton crew. We gathered around the entrance in silence, listening to the increasingly desperate pleas from outside. "My name is David Chen. I'm a researcher from McMurdo Station. My snowcat broke down about 2 kilometers from here. Please, you have to let me in." The name sent ice through my veins. David Chen, the meteorologist whose journal I'd found in the archives. The man who'd documented mysterious voices and unexplained disappearances before his own entries stopped abruptly 3 years ago. I caught Harrix's eye and saw recognition there. He knew the name too. "Check the roster," Harrix whispered to Martinez, though we all knew what it would show. Martinez consulted the personnel manifest on his tablet, scrolling through current assignments and scheduled arrivals. No David Chen listed. No incoming personnel until the next supply flight, which isn't due for another week. The knocking resumed, weaker now but still insistent. Please. I can see lights inside. I know you're there. I'm freezing to death out here. Dr. Ivers moved closer to the entrance, her face pale but determined. David Chen was assigned to Halcyon during the 2020 season, she said quietly. He disappeared during a winter storm just like this one. They never found his body. Then who's outside? Martinez asked. Something that wants us to think it's David Chen, Herrick's replied. Something that's learned his name, his voice, his history. Something that needs an invitation to come inside. The voice outside grew more desperate, more human, more impossible to ignore. My hands are numb. Can't feel my feet. Please, just for a few hours. I have a family. Kids in Denver. I thought about the journal entries I'd read, about David Chen's daughter crying outside his lab window, about the things Dr. Ivers had told me regarding how they learned our weaknesses and exploited our psychology. But what if it really was David Chen? What if he'd somehow survived 3 years in the Antarctic wilderness, finally making his way back to civilization during the worst storm of the season? What if our paranoia was condemning an innocent person to death? So we have to check, I said, reaching for the door controls. Herrick grabbed my wrist. No, the roster is clear. No scheduled arrivals, no emergency notifications from McMurdo. Whatever's outside, it's not human. But what if it is? What if the records are wrong? Or there was a communication failure? The voice outside was barely audible now, weak and fading. Please. I can't feel anything anymore. Every moral instinct I possessed screamed at me to open that door. No matter what paranoid delusions had infected this isolated outpost, I couldn't stand by and let another human being freeze to death, mere feet away from shelter and safety. I pulled free from Herrick's grip and reached for the door release. Eli, stop. Dr. Ivers stepped between me and the controls. Look at this. She held up her tablet, displaying the external sensor readings in real time. The infrared showed no heat signature near the main entrance. No body warmth, no evidence of a living person standing outside in the storm. But the knocking continued, and the voice kept pleading for help. There's nothing there, she said softly. No person, no equipment, no footprints in the snow. Just empty space making sounds that our brains interpret as human distress. I stared at the readings, trying to reconcile the absence of physical evidence with the unmistakable sound of someone dying just outside our door. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. My senses told me one thing, the instruments another. This is what they do, Dr. Ivers continued. They find our breaking points and exploit them. They know we can't ignore calls for help, can't abandon people in distress. So they create perfect simulations of emergency situations that trigger our rescue instincts. The voice outside gave one final, heartbreaking plea. Sarah, tell Sarah I tried to come home. Tell her I love... Then silence. The knocking stopped. The voice faded, and we were left standing in the corridor listening to nothing but wind and our own rapid breathing. I slumped against the wall, emotionally drained and morally defeated. I'd followed the rules, trusted the instruments over my instincts, allowed protocol to override compassion. If David Chen or whoever was outside had been real, I'd just participated in his murder. But if he hadn't been real, I just avoided becoming another disappeared name on Herrick's personnel roster. First time's always the hardest, Martinez said quietly, echoing words Herrick's had spoken to me weeks earlier. You did the right thing, Herrick's added. The only thing that keeps us alive out here. But as I returned to my quarters and tried to sleep through the remainder of the storm, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. I'd crossed a line that night, choosing survival over humanity, protocol over morality. The rules had saved my life, but they'd cost me something else, the certainty that I was still a good person. In the morning, I would wake up as someone who could ignore calls for help, who could rationalize abandoning the dying based on sensor readings and personnel rosters. I'd become exactly the kind of person who could survive at Halcyon Base, and that terrified me more than anything waiting in the storm outside. The power failed at 2:17 a.m. on a Thursday morning, exactly 4 weeks after I'd arrived at Halcyon Base. I know the precise time because I was lying awake in my bunk, staring at the digital clock display when it suddenly went black along with every other light in the facility. The silence that followed was absolute. No generators humming, no ventilation fans circulating air, no electronic systems maintaining the delicate balance that kept us alive in the Antarctic wilderness. Just the sound of wind outside and 8 people breathing in the darkness. Emergency lighting kicked in after 30 seconds, bathing the corridors in dim red that made everything look like a scene from hell. I pulled on clothes and boots, grabbed my emergency flashlight and joined the other crew members gathering in the main corridor. "Generator room," Harrick barked, his voice tight with controlled panic. "Martinez, get to communications and try to raise McMurdo. Everyone else, emergency stations. We need power restored in the East Wing immediately." The East Wing. Rule 5. Lights must never go out in the East Wing. I followed Harricks through the maze of corridors toward the power generation facility, our flashlight beams creating wild shadows that seemed to move independently of our passage. The temperature was already dropping noticeably, without active heating. Halcyon Base would become uninhabitable within hours, but the cold was the least of our concerns. As we navigated the darkened passages, I became aware of sounds that shouldn't have been there. Scratching within the walls like fingernails drawn across metal. Whispers that might have been wind through vents, or might have been something else entirely. Movement in peripheral vision that resolved into empty corridors when I turned to look directly. "They're testing the boundaries," Dr. Ivers said quietly, her voice barely audible over our footsteps. "The darkness weakens the barriers. They can move more freely, manifest more completely." In the generator room we found chaos. The main power unit had shut down completely, its diagnostic systems showing cascading failures that made no technical sense. Fuel lines were intact, electrical connections showed normal continuity, mechanical components appeared undamaged. Yet the system refused to restart, as if some fundamental component of its operation had simply ceased to function. "This is impossible," Martinez said, running diagnostics on the backup generators. "These units are triple redundant. They can't all fail simultaneously without external cause, but they had failed. All of them. Every power generation system in Halcyon Base had stopped working at the same moment, leaving us dependent on battery-powered emergency lighting that would last perhaps 6 hours. External cause, Harricks muttered, studying the readouts with growing alarm. "They're learning new tricks." As if summoned by his words, the scratching sounds grew louder and more organized. Not random noise, but purposeful movement. Something large displacing through spaces too small to accommodate normal passage. The emergency lighting flickered intermittently, casting the generator room in strobing red that made depth perception impossible. "Get the East Wing back online," Harricks ordered. "Whatever it takes. Portable generators, battery packs, anything with a power source." I grabbed a heavy-duty flashlight and emergency power kit, making my way toward the East Wing through corridors that seemed to stretch longer than I remembered. The scratching sounds followed me, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, always just at the edge of hearing. My breath formed clouds in the rapidly cooling air, and frost was already beginning to accumulate on the metal walls. The East Wing felt different in the darkness. Older, colder, as if it existed in a separate reality from the rest of Halcyon Base. My flashlight beam revealed details I'd never noticed during routine maintenance. Scorch marks on the walls, gouges in the metal that looked like claw marks, symbols scratched into door frames that hurt to look at directly. I set up the portable generator in the main corridor and began connecting emergency lighting, working frantically to restore illumination before whatever dwelt in the darkness could establish a permanent foothold. But as I worked, I became aware that I wasn't alone. Figures moved in the shadows beyond my flashlight's reach, human shapes that shouldn't have been there, walking with purpose through areas I knew were empty. As I caught glimpses of them in peripheral vision, I recognized faces from the archived personnel logs. David Chen, the meteorologist who'd documented voices in the snow. Sarah Martinez, the biologist who'd heard her daughter crying outside her lab window. Lucas Trent, cocky and dismissive even in whatever form of existence he'd been reduced to. They watched me work with hollow eyes that reflected my flashlight beam like an animal's. When I looked directly at them, they faded into the darkness, but I could feel their attention like weight pressing against my shoulders. "Hello, Eli," one of them said. Lucas's voice, but wrong somehow, like an imperfect recording played back through damaged speakers. Having trouble with the lights? I ignored him, focusing on the generator connections. The portable unit roared to life, flooding a small section of corridor with harsh white light. The figures retreated, but didn't disappear entirely. "You can't keep us out forever," Sarah Martinez's voice drifted from the darkness. "The barriers are weakening. Soon we'll be able to walk freely through all your lighted spaces." "Just like we always could," David Chen added with hollow laughter. "The lights were never protection. They were just delay tactics." I moved to the next section of corridor, setting up additional emergency lighting while the figures followed just beyond the reach of illumination. Their voices grew stronger, more confident, as if the darkness fed their ability to manifest. "You're fighting for nothing," Lucas taunted. "This base is already lost. Everyone here will join us eventually. Some tonight, others later, but the ending is inevitable." The generator sputtered and died. I checked the fuel lines, the electrical connections, the mechanical components. Everything appeared functional, but the unit refused to restart. Around me, the emergency lighting began to fade as battery power drained away. "Technical difficulties?" David Chen asked, his voice now coming from directly behind me. I spun around, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness to reveal empty corridor. But I could hear breathing that wasn't mine, footsteps that matched my own movements, the sound of something large displacing through space that should have been vacant. In desperation, I tried a different approach. Instead of fighting the failing systems, I began connecting lights directly to my portable battery packs, jury-rigged solutions that bypassed the central power grid entirely. The connections were crude and temporary, but they worked. Section by section, I restored illumination to the east wing using every emergency power source I could find. The figures retreated as light returned, their voices fading but not disappearing entirely. "Clever," Lucas admitted, "but battery power won't last forever. And we have all the time in the world." By dawn, I'd managed to restore minimal lighting throughout the east wing, using a patchwork of temporary solutions. The main generators remained offline, but the immediate crisis had passed. As natural sunlight began filtering through the facility's windows, the oppressive atmosphere of the night gradually lifted. Harrix found me slumped against a wall in the east wing corridor, surrounded by the debris of my emergency repairs. I was exhausted, frostbitten, and probably suffering from mild hypothermia, but the lights were on. "Status report," he said quietly. "Temporary solution," I managed. "Battery power for maybe 12 hours. We need to get the main generators working. Already handled." Martinez found the problem. Sabotage to the fuel injection systems. Someone or something had introduced sand into the fuel lines. I looked up at him, understanding dawning slowly through my exhaustion. "So they can manipulate physical objects now. Not just voices and shadows, actual mechanical systems," Harrix nodded grimly. "They're evolving, learning new ways to break down our defenses." He helped me to my feet, studying the improvised lighting systems I'd installed. "But you held the line, kept them from establishing a permanent foothold in the east wing." As we walked back toward the main facility, I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, figures that faded when I looked directly at them. Voices that might have been wind through heating ducts. They hadn't been banished by my emergency repairs, just forced to retreat to the margins of perception. "They'll try again," I said. "Of course they will." Harrix paused at the entrance to the main corridor. "But you've proven something important tonight, Morgan. You followed the rules under extreme pressure, maintained the barriers when everything else failed. That's what survival looks like at Halcyon Base." I wanted to feel proud of my accomplishment, but all I could think about was Lucas's final words: "Battery power won't last forever." And we have all the time in the world. We'd won a battle, but the war was far from over, and every victory seemed to teach them new strategies for the next encounter. The main generators came back online at 800 hours, their steady hum returning life support systems to normal operation. Martinez had worked through the night to clear sand from the fuel injection systems, sand that had appeared in sealed fuel lines with no explanation for how it got there. The diagnostic computers showed no evidence of system breach, no indication of external tampering, no logical reason for the contamination. But the sand was real. Fine-grained, consistent with Antarctic mineral composition, somehow introduced into closed systems with surgical precision designed to cause maximum disruption at the worst possible moment. Impossible doesn't seem to apply here, Martinez said when I asked how sand could spontaneously materialize inside sealed fuel lines. I've stopped trying to rationalize the technical failures. Now I just fix them and move on. The crew returned to normal routines with the mechanical efficiency I'd come to expect at Halcyon Base. Nobody discussed the night's events directly, though I caught significant glances exchanged during the morning briefing. Emergency repairs were logged and documented. Generator maintenance was added to the schedule, and the watch roster was updated to include additional power system checks. But the atmosphere had changed in subtle ways that were difficult to articulate. Conversations seemed more guarded, eye contact briefer, personal spaces more carefully maintained. People moved through their duties with the heightened awareness of prey animals who'd survived a predator's attack, but knew it was still nearby. I spent the morning replacing my jury-rigged emergency lighting with proper electrical connections, working in the East Wing corridors that had become a battlefield the night before. In daylight, with full power restored, the area looked mundane, just another section of prefabricated modules and utilitarian fixtures. The scorch marks and claw gouges were still there, but they seemed like old damage rather than active threats. Yet I couldn't shake the memory of figures moving in the darkness, voices calling from shadows that shouldn't have contained anything more threatening than dust and recycled air. The boundaries between normal and impossible had blurred during those hours of system failure, revealing glimpses of a reality that existed parallel to our own. Getting used to it gets easier, Dr. Ivers said, appearing in the corridor with her tablet and sensor equipment. The cognitive dissonance, I mean. The knowledge that you're living in a place where normal physical laws don't always apply. She was running environmental scans, checking for residual electromagnetic anomalies from the night's activities. Her instruments showed elevated readings throughout the East Wing, subtle distortions that registered just above baseline normal. What are the long-term effects? I asked. Of exposure to whatever this is. Dr. Ivers considered the question while studying her data. Psychological adaptation, mostly. You learn to compartmentalize impossible experiences, to function normally despite knowing that reality is more fragile than most people believe. She paused her scanning to look at me directly. But it changes you, makes you hyper-aware of sounds and movements that other people would dismiss, makes you follow rules that seem arbitrary to anyone who hasn't seen the consequences of breaking them. I thought about the morning's interactions with the crew, the way everyone moved with subtle caution, the way normal conversations contained gaps where certain topics weren't discussed. We were all living with shared knowledge that couldn't be processed through conventional understanding. How many people have disappeared over the years? I asked. Officially? 3 documented fatalities in 15 years of operation. Unofficially? She gestured toward the storage archives, where I'd found the hidden logs. 23 names crossed off personnel rosters with various explanations. Equipment failures, weather incidents, medical emergencies that required evacuation, but never showed up in hospital records. 23 people. Nearly 2 per year, vanishing into explanations that satisfied bureaucratic requirements, but concealed the truth about Halcyon Base's ongoing war of attrition. Why do we stay? The question came out before I could stop it, revealing doubts I'd been trying to suppress. Dr. Ivers finished her scanning and powered down the sensor array. Same reason people stay in any dangerous occupation. The money's good, the work is important, and someone has to do it. But mainly because leaving doesn't solve the problem. What do you mean? They're not confined to this location. Eli, they exist anywhere the conditions are right. Extreme isolation, psychological stress, people pushed beyond normal survival parameters. She packed her equipment with methodical care. Arctic research stations report similar phenomena. Deep ocean facilities, underground installations, space stations, anywhere humans try to establish footholds in environments that weren't meant for us. The implications settled like ice in my stomach. Halcyon Base wasn't unique, it was just one battlefield in a larger conflict between human, expansion and entities that had existed long before civilization. Developed the technology to invade their territories, but the rules work here, I said. We've learned to survive. For now. But they're learning too, adapting their tactics. based on our responses. Last night's power failure was more sophisticated than anything documented in the archives. They're developing new strategies, testing new approaches to break down our defenses. I spent the rest of the day reviewing emergency procedures and backup systems, preparing for the next escalation in what Dr. Ivers had accurately described as an ongoing conflict. But as evening approached, I found myself checking window, latches and door seals with obsessive attention to detail. The rules felt different now. Not arbitrary restrictions, but battle-tested survival protocols developed through 15 years of trial and error. Each one represented someone's final lesson about the consequences of underestimating our invisible opponents. During dinner, Harrix announced personnel changes that surprised no one who'd been paying attention to the subtle dynamics of base operations. I was being promoted to senior maintenance technician, with additional responsibilities for emergency power systems and East Wing security protocols. Morgan's proven he can handle crisis situations, Harrix explained to the assembled crew. He's also demonstrated proper adherence to safety procedures under extreme stress. Translation: I'd followed the rules when it mattered most, keeping the barriers intact when everything else failed. I'd earned the right to help train others in the survival techniques that separated living crew members from names crossed off personnel rosters. After dinner, I found myself standing at my quarters window, watching the Antarctic landscape under the perpetual summer sun. The view was the same as always, endless white stretching to the horizon, wind patterns creating temporary sculptures in the snow, the vast emptiness that made Halcyon Base feel like humanity's most remote outpost. But now I knew we weren't alone out there. Something patient and intelligent waited in that emptiness, studying our patterns and testing our defenses. It had learned our names, our voices, our deepest psychological vulnerabilities. It could manipulate our technology, exploit our moral instincts, and gradually erode the arbitrary barriers that kept it at bay. The rules weren't just survival. Protocols. They were the terms of an uneasy truce with forces that tolerated our presence as long as we stayed within carefully defined parameters. Step outside those boundaries, and you became another lesson for whoever survived to document your disappearance. I pulled my copy of the laminated rule card from my pocket, studying it by the light of my desk lamp. The 5 simple restrictions that had seemed so absurd during my first week now felt like sacred text wisdom, purchased with blood and written by people who'd learned too late what happened when you ignored warnings that seemed too strange to take seriously. Outside my window, something moved across the snow with purpose and intelligence. I didn't look directly at it, didn't try to identify what it might be. Rule 1 was clear about looking out windows after midnight, but it was only 9 p.m. Still, some instincts transcended specific prohibitions. I latched the inner panel and turned away, settling in to read Dr. Ivers' supplementary protocols by lamplight until exhaustion finally allowed me to sleep. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of our survival skills, new opportunities for the entities outside to probe our defenses. But tonight, the light stayed on in the East Wing, and the rules held firm against whatever waited in the endless Antarctic darkness. The transport plane arrived on schedule 3 weeks later, its engines cutting through the eternal wind with mechanical precision that seemed almost miraculous after months of isolation. I watched from the communications center as Santos brought her aircraft down on the makeshift runway, cargo bay doors opening to disgorge supplies, equipment, and 3 new personnel assignments, fresh faces. New meat. As Harrix grimly referred to incoming crew members during his private moments, I'd volunteered to handle the orientation process, partly from professional duty, but mostly from morbid curiosity about how newcomers would react to Halcyon Base's peculiar survival requirements. 3 months ago, I'd been the skeptical engineer dismissing supernatural warnings as institutional paranoia. Now I was the senior maintenance technician, responsible for keeping people alive in a place where death wore familiar faces and spoke in voices that could break your heart. The new arrivals were typical contractor types, competent professionals looking for good money and adventure in exotic locations. Janet Rodriguez, a communications specialist from Denver. Michael Park, a mechanical engineer with Arctic experience. Sarah Hendricks, a meteorologist fresh out of graduate school, who reminded me uncomfortably of myself during those first uncertain days. "Welcome to the end of the world," I said, echoing Harricks's greeting from my own arrival. But where his words had seemed like dramatic posturing, mine carried the weight of earned knowledge. During the supply transfer, I helped Janet Rodriguez set up her equipment in the communications center. She was efficient, professional, asking technical questions about system specifications and maintenance schedules. Normal concerns for someone taking over critical infrastructure in an isolated environment. "The radio protocols seem unusual," she mentioned, while calibrating the emergency frequencies. "Mandatory response on first call. Specific procedural requirements for off-base communications. Is that standard for Antarctic operations?" "It's standard here," I replied carefully. "You'll find that Halcyon Base has developed some unique operational procedures over the years, all based on hard-earned experience." Michael Park expressed similar curiosity about the East Wing power systems, noting the redundant lighting circuits and backup generators that seemed disproportionate to the facility's actual needs. "Electrical failures can be fatal in this environment," I explained, showing him the emergency protocols I'd developed after the night of the system breakdown. "We maintain triple redundancy in critical areas because normal troubleshooting procedures don't always work out here." But it was Sarah Hendricks who asked the questions I'd been dreading. The safety briefing mentioned behavioral restrictions that seem more psychological than environmental. She said during our tour of the weather monitoring station, "Specific rules about windows, doors, responding to voices outside." "Are those based on documented incidents?" I paused in my explanation of the atmospheric sensors, remembering my own dismissive reaction to similar warnings. Sarah was sharp, analytical, exactly the kind of person who would demand logical explanations for arbitrary-seeming rules. "They're based on experience," I said finally. 15 years of people learning what works and what doesn't in this particular environment. But what's the mechanism? What environmental factors make those specific behaviors dangerous? The honest answer, that something intelligent and malevolent stalked Halcyon Base, learning our weaknesses and exploiting them with surgical precision, would have sounded like paranoid delusion. I'd thought the same thing during my first weeks, dismissing warnings as institutional mythology. "Antarctica does things to people's minds," I said instead. "Isolation, sensory deprivation, extreme stress. The rules help maintain psychological stability by providing clear behavioral boundaries." Sarah nodded, but I could see she wasn't entirely convinced. She had the same skeptical intelligence that had made me question the protocols, the same rational confidence that had nearly gotten me killed. After the orientation tour, I found Harricks in his office updating personnel files and duty assignments. The old captain looked even more weathered than when I'd arrived, as if each new crew rotation aged him disproportionately. "How do they look?" he asked without glancing up from his paperwork. "Competent, professional. Rodriguez has good technical skills, Park knows his way around mechanical systems. Hendricks is smart, maybe too smart. Smart ones are always trouble. They think they can figure out better ways to do things." Harricks finished his entries and looked up with tired eyes. "You remember being that confident?" "Vividly. What changed your mind?" "I thought about Lucas disappearing into bare footprints that led nowhere. About voices calling my name in perfect imitation of people I'd loved. About figures moving through darkened corridors during power failures that shouldn't have been possible. Experience," I said. "The kind you can't get from textbooks or safety manuals." That evening, I prepared 3 laminated cards with practiced efficiency, printing the 5 rules on heavy cardstock and sealing them in protective plastic. The routine had become automatic, like any other piece of equipment maintenance. I found the new crew members in the dining area sharing stories about their previous assignments and making plans for their year-long deployment. Normal human interaction in what felt like a parody of social normalcy. "Before you settle in completely," I said, distributing the rule cards, "everyone needs to review these survival protocols. They're mandatory for all Halcyon personnel." Sarah. Hendricks read her card with the same expression I'd probably worn 3 months earlier. Polite. "Attention masking intellectual dismissal. Never look out the windows after midnight," she read aloud. "Do not follow voices outside. These seem more like folklore than operational procedures. They're both, I replied. Follow them anyway. But what's the rationale? If we understand the underlying safety concerns, we can make better decisions about implementation. Janet Rodriguez looked up from her own card with similar confusion. Some of these restrictions contradict standard emergency protocols. If someone's in distress outside, normal procedure is immediate rescue response. Not here, I said firmly. Here, you check the roster before opening any door. You answer radio calls on the first ring. You keep the East Wing lights operational at all costs. I paused, studying their faces, the same mixture of skepticism and professional courtesy I'd shown during my own orientation. Your lives depend on following these rules exactly as written, without interpretation or modification. Michael Park laughed, the same dismissive sound Lucas had made before his disappearance. Come on, Eli, you seem like a rational guy. You can't seriously believe in whatever ghost stories these rules are based on. I believe in results, I said. People who follow the rules survive their assignments. People who don't follow them get added to the casualty statistics. After dinner, I retreated to my quarters and pulled out the personnel files I'd inherited, along with my promotion to senior technician. 23 names crossed off rosters over 15 years, each with an official explanation that satisfied bureaucratic requirements, while concealing the truth about their disappearances. The pattern was always the same. Confident professionals who arrived with rational skepticism gradually wore down by isolation and stress, eventually making the kind of mistake that fed whatever stalked Halcyon Base. The rules weren't suggestions. They were accumulated wisdom purchased with human lives. Outside my window, the Antarctic landscape stretched endlessly under the midnight sun. Somewhere in that emptiness, patient entities waited for the next person to decide they knew better than 15 years of hard-earned survival protocols. I thought about Sarah Hendricks's analytical questions, Michael Park's dismissive laughter, Janet Rodriguez's confusion about emergency procedures. 3 more rational people who would spend the next few weeks looking for logical explanations for arbitrary restrictions. Some of them would learn fast enough to survive. Others would become object lessons for whoever came next. I settled in to read Dr. Ivers's supplementary protocols by lamplight, preparing for another year of training newcomers in the delicate art of staying alive in a place where the rules of reality bent under the weight of something that had been waiting long before humans learned to build shelters against the cold tomorrow. I would begin teaching them what Lucas had refused to learn, what I'd nearly discovered too late, that survival sometimes required abandoning logic in favor of blind obedience to warnings that seemed too strange to take seriously. The cycle continued, as it always had, as it always would, fresh faces arriving with confident skepticism, learning gradually that Halcyon Base operated under rules that transcended normal understanding. And in the endless white beyond our fragile barriers, something patient and intelligent continued its eternal vigil, waiting for the next person to break the covenant that kept us precariously alive at the bottom of the world. The transport plane would return in 12 months to collect survivors and deliver fresh replacements. The question was how many names would still be on the roster when it arrived, and how many new rules would be written in the margins of the survival protocols. I latched the inner window panel and turned away from the view outside, settling in to sleep with the laminated rule card under my pillow. 5 simple restrictions that had become as essential to my survival as oxygen and warmth. Some lessons were too important to forget, too costly to ignore, too strange to explain to anyone who hadn't lived through the education process themselves. In the morning, I would begin teaching the newcomers what it meant to survive at Halcyon Base. The rules were waiting,